Founded in 1909, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, better known as the NAACP, is now the oldest grassroots civil rights organization in the world and currently has over 500,000 members worldwide. The NAACP fought tooth and nail in many vital civil rights cases and was one of the most important organizations of the time period. Due to the incredible things that the NAACP's Legal Defense and Educational Fund was able to accomplish through litigation, the NAACP became known as the legal arm of the civil rights movement. The NAACP was built on the ideals of the Naacp movement, a group of 30 African American intellectuals. After a group of white people in New York decided to ally themselves with some of the members of the Naacp movement, the NAACP was born. Some notable members of the group include W.E.B. Du Bois, Ida Wells Barnett, Mary White Ovington, Thurgood Marshall, and countless others. The NAACP was formed in order to combat race-based discrimination of African Americans. The organization wanted to obtain equal rights for all American citizens and worked to achieve this goal by attempting to pass legislation that would secure 14th and 15th Amendment rights for African Americans. The NAACP also began releasing editions of The Crisis magazine in 1910, the oldest African American publication in the world. This magazine was designed to inform African Americans on social and racial issues that were hindering their everyday lives. This magazine raised the awareness of the average African American, making them a lot more familiar with the issues that affected their community. On top of this, the magazine was also one of the first methods of expression for African Americans in the civil rights movement. In 1910, Oklahoma passed the infamous Grandfather Clause. This meant, in essence, that African Americans would not be able to vote. After catching wind of this, the NAACP took immediate action. After years of battling, the NAACP got the Supreme Court to rule that grandfather clauses were unconstitutional in the case of Ginn v. United States in 1915. This marked the first major battle won in court by the NAACP, and it would certainly not be the last. In 1917, the NAACP organized a silent march in New York City. This march protested the lynching of African Americans, along with other forms of racial violence. 10,000 people marched in New York City, an astoundingly high number. This march was one of the first instances of mass demonstrations to protest racial injustice and violence. This lit a fire under the NAACP, and passing anti-lynching laws became a primary focus for the organization soon after its inception. However, they were never successful in this goal. Although the NAACP was active during what we know as the long civil rights movement, the organization really gained traction and national attention during the 1950s and 60s, during what is known as the traditional civil rights movement. The first victory that the NAACP helped achieve was the decision in the 1954 case of Brown v. Board of Education. The NAACP, alongside its legal faction, the Legal Defense and Educational Fund, argued this case and were against the separate but equal laws. Thurgood Marshall, founder and head of the LDF, was the lead attorney during this case. He successfully argued the case. The decision outlawed segregation in public schools, and it was a huge success for the NAACP and America as a whole. The NAACP remained very active during this time period, helping organize the 1963 March on Washington and the Freedom Summer of 1964 in Mississippi. After Freedom Summer, the LDF opened an office in Jackson, Mississippi, one of the most racist states in America at the time. The NAACP was also key in lobbying for the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and later the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which made racial discrimination during voting illegal. These were two of the most pivotal decisions in all of the civil rights movement. All of these crucial decisions and cases would not have come to fruition if the Legal Defense and Educational Fund did not exist. The LDF was the legal arm of the NAACP and took care of all litigation and court-related matters. The LDF has been involved in more Supreme Court decisions than any other organization in America. However, some people were not too fond of the LDF's methods. Many people criticize the NAACP and LDF for being too focused on the legal system and only working to help African Americans through litigation. However, racism was so strong and commonplace during this time period that many believed the legal organization designed to enfranchise African Americans was essential. Although the NAACP was a key part of the civil rights movement, it is often overlooked by many as it mostly worked behind the scenes to bring about change. Many attribute this to the organization's strong involvement with Martin Luther King Jr. and other public figures in the civil rights movement. King had an incredible ability to captivate an audience and appeal to their emotions and conscience. The NAACP was more focused on appealing to reason and intellect and was not as captivating as King. The NAACP themselves said that they did not involve the masses in social issues as well as Dr. King did. This may have led to the public not fully appreciating the NAACP and all of its historical accomplishments. Another reason why the NAACP is underappreciated by some is due to the legal nature of their approach, which took longer to produce results than other approaches, such as the marches or boycotts that were in the spotlight of the civil rights movement. The NAACP remains a strong organization to this day and was an essential piece in the reconstruction of American values, society, and their Constitution. The NAACP ensured that African Americans were able to secure the rights that they deserved. The NAACP was a very important organization during the civil rights movement and was a group that African Americans could trust had their best interest at heart. It is important that we do not forget all the important things that the NAACP did for America and how instrumental the organization was to the civil rights movement.